Live now. We are live.
Hey,
Welcome,
everybody.
everyone. Shalom. Thank you for watching a live episode of Race Matters tonight. We have an awesome show for you. I am Sharon Thomas. I am one of the hosts, and my co-host is Rosie Anderson and Mariana Spataro. And again, like I said, we have a great show in store for you tonight. Our great, wonderful featured guest is Dr. Randolph Walters, and he has so many specialties. But we're going to hone in on racial trauma tonight because it's such a serious issue that we don't talk enough about. So Race Matters wants to highlight that conversation and keep it in the forefront of the conversation by having Dr. Walters on tonight. And he'll be back on June the 23rd to talk about racial healing, because where there's trauma, there needs to be healing. So this is part one with Dr. Walters with racial trauma, and part two, June 23rd, will be racial healing. So before we get into the questions, we're going to let Mariana give you a brief bio. He has a long bio, but we would be here for the whole 45 minutes if we read it. Because he's well accomplished. So Mariana, can you tell the audience a little bit about Dr. Walters?
Yeah, well, so since Sharon, you told me that Dr. Walters agreed, I couldn't wait for this day. So I'm so excited. It's finally here. Dr. Walters is someone that I know very well. I tried to count how many classes I took with him, and I found at least 7, and I'm not sure if I'm missing 1 or 2 more. So I sat a lot in his classes and learned from his wisdom and from his preaching, which will come up in classes sometimes too. That's just who he is. So, if you see his name, there's an alphabet of letters afterwards, and that just speaks to the amount of things he has accomplished, like writing some books. One of them, I was a student of his during the 2015 or so time when he had published the book on attachment between a father and a daughter. And then I know he wrote another one. He's been a pastor of family life, from what I recall, during those years of taking classes with him. He's been in private practice for over 20 years. He has taught at Eastern for just as many years, if not more.
28.
28. Wow.
Wow.
So that just tells us how much. And yet, along with that, all of those accomplishments doesn't change who he is. He will sit with you when you need time and will help you through anything. He's very approachable. He loves what he does, has a passion for the work of helping others. I took a few classes from the trauma concentration, which was being built just around the time I was graduating. And I got to really understand how much he also gets trauma through those classes. And I'm just really excited for this topic of trauma in the context of racial experiences. So yeah, I'm super excited and honored to introduce someone as special as Dr. Walters.
So welcome, Dr. Walters. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's good
So
to be.
we're going to just jump right into it. Dr. Walters, please share with us in the audience what racial trauma is.
Okay. Before I attempt to sort of define racial trauma in a specific way, I want to talk about what trauma is. Because if we talk about racial trauma and we don't know what trauma is, then we're going to really miss it. And so a lot of people use the word trauma very loosely. So I want to break that down and explain it and then connect it to a specific racial trauma is a specific kind of trauma. So the word trauma, trauma is really an emotional scar. I call it a psychic wound. Trauma is like a wound that continues, it persists. So you have a wound and it just continues and it festers. And that wound is so deep that it can change your sense of self, who you are, the trajectory of your life. Often trauma is seen as sometimes as an event. So we can make a distinction between trauma as an event. So there's a car accident, for example, and someone says, oh, he had trauma. That was trauma. And so the difference between a negative event that produces distress on the one hand and the actual effect of the trauma. But if we go to the root of the word trauma comes from a Greek word that means wound. And in the mental health field, we've really borrowed from medical science, because we can think, for example, here we are in Philadelphia, and we know that there are a number of hospitals. Not every hospital has a trauma unit, only specific hospitals. I think of Temple University, for example. You know, if there's a major accident or gun shooting, there are hospitals that handle wound care and so on, that are set up to deal with that. So we have borrowed that word trauma from the medical field. And so when we translate it in a psychological sense, in mental health, it's really a wound, all right? And so if we think about human nature, that we have a capacity to deal with things the way that God has created us.
Mm-hmm.
And so when trauma happens, it is an event that is overwhelming, that it overwhelms and floods our capacity to cope and to manage. You know, sometimes you might notice that your lights go off and you're wondering, well, why my lights go off? You know, Sharon, did you pay the bill? And she said, yes, I paid the Pico bill. And then we looked outside and we noticed that our neighbor's lights are on, and we're wondering what's going on. Well, you know what has happened? We have too many things plugged in one socket. And so we have a circuit breaker, a circuit break. That's what happens when there's trauma, that we have an experience that's so overwhelming that it overwhelms our capacity to cope and to manage. And there is trauma, there is that wound, that scar. And we have to understand that for some people, trauma is a normal experience. If we think about parts of the world in the Middle East and war-torn countries where individuals, their daily lives, there's some kind of experience. I fantasize sometimes about really studying people who have daily experiences of trauma. And for some of us, trauma is periodic. And so we have to understand then that trauma is really an injury, it's not an illness. And so the question we always ask in trauma is not what's wrong with you. We're very quick. We're talking earlier, Rosie, about mental health. We are very quick to say, what's wrong with you, Rosie? We never ask what's wrong with you. We ask what happened to you. Trauma is not an illness. It is more an event, is an injury. Something happens.
Right.
And so we have to understand that. And I draw a lot from the work of Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the premier experts on trauma. If you ever get his book called The Body Keeps the Score, is excellent. He's a psychiatrist. But he talks about the imprint of trauma is in the limbic system, and the brain stem, and what we call our animal brain, not the thinking brain. I can come back and break that down. What trauma does to the brain. So that is trauma. It hurts. And trauma is unique to everybody because we carry trauma in our bodies. Yes. And I want to talk about that on the 23rd. I hope you join us again. Trauma also, to borrow a term from a colleague of mine who wrote a book on trauma, Dr. R. Dandridge Collins, trauma can't tell time, right? When we're traumatized, we behave like we're still back there. This thing happened in 1984, but we're still responding as though it is happening right now. So if you understand trauma, then what is racial trauma or racialized trauma? So the individual has an experience. When we talk about racial trauma, it is the grief and the stress that people of color experience as a result of racial, ethnic experiences of discrimination, being treated differently. It refers to the wounds, the psychological wounds, which include emotions as well, cognitive and emotional wounds and scars as a result of being treated different. And people of color, a fancy term we use, BIPOC, BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so it's essentially race-based stress. That is what racial trauma is in a large extent, right? And so that's what we're talking about. And I'll come back and break down some things. So it is the kind of emotional wound, the scar, the psychic injury that is a consequence of racial events, of being treated differently that people of color experience.
So Dr. Walters, given what you have just said, and of course this won't be specific, but if you could just guesstimate, if you will, in American society, those people who fall under the BIPOC category, what would you think is a general percentage of us who have experienced racial trauma?
My quick answer might be 100%, but it's certainly north of 90%. One of the things that we hope to do in this show is to help people to understand, because there are a lot of us that have experiences and we don't categorize it as racial trauma. We are so used to getting looked at differently or being pulled over or whatever. And so we see it as racism, and we may not think of it as trauma. And when we get into microaggressions, I can't imagine if you live long enough in this country as a BIPOC individual that you haven't experienced some kind of racial trauma. So my quick answer might be 100%, but certainly I'm going to just say 100% of people.
Right.
Everyone.
You mentioned microaggressions. Can you, because some people watching might not know what microaggressions are. So
when we talk about microaggressions, right, we're talking about microaggressions are, if we think about the idea of being passive aggressive, right? When people are passive aggressive, they act out their feelings and their aggression in seemingly indirect ways. And in microaggressions, we're talking about subtle insults and put downs. Many of us in many communities in corporate America and a lot of the places that we work, the way that people in white bodies talk to us, the subtle insults and put downs, even, and some of it, often a lot of microaggressions comes not because people are intentionally doing it, but they're not aware they're doing it. And so Rosie just did a beautiful presentation, and a white person walks up to her and says, you speak very well. And they're so impressed because they have a perception of her as a Black woman and her ability to be able to communicate and to be present as confident. So they're micro insults. All right. And sometimes it is intentional. So there are the subtle ways that we devalue people of color, that we insult people of color. It also comes out in ways of white privilege. So many years ago, I'll give you a quick example. I was in Lancaster with my wife, went to a bed and breakfast. I went to this store to purchase something. I went during the day, and the cashier was a Hispanic woman. I went to the cashier, paid for my item, no problem. I returned in the evening to the same store and purchased something again. The cashier was a white female. And right in front of me was a white female, the customer in front of me. When the customer got to the cashier, who was a white female, as I said, she paid for her item, used her card, no problem. When I got to the cashier, you know what she said? She asked me for my ID. You don't understand what white privilege is. That's white privilege. So because I am a person of color, Black man, which is clearly evident, I was assumed to not have credibility. And people of color experience that oftentimes. Going to the court and so on, you're treated differently. That's the microaggression, right? So there are these subtle insults, put downs, ways of devaluing individuals, invalidating your experiences. That's what microaggressions are. And there's several examples of those.
That passive aggressive.
If you live in a Black body, or a brown body, you know what that is.
And Pastor, oops, I said that. I hope you don't mind.
I'm that too, so that's okay.
So, but it's such a crazy experience because I had shared with Sharon in it, because for a number of years I worked for a utility company. Mm-hmm. People don't understand, and I didn't understand the title. If you all see me looking sideways, I'm writing down some stuff that Dr. Waters has said, because I'm coming back to this before we get to the next show. This is so good. But working for the utility company, I had questions asked of me. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was so hard because I wasn't sure if they were asking because I was a female or if I was a person of color, And one of them was in one of the instances, I had walked into it was like a warehouse, and I had my tools on, and I was approached by 5 white gentlemen. I guess they were supervisors, managers, or whatever. And they didn't even understand the level of what they said, because when they approached me, their question to me was, how does it feel being a minority? So me being Black and female, my first thought was Black, a person of color, because every one of them were white. And I was offended. I said, excuse me, what? And then they noticed what they said, and they still shifted it to a different one, but they didn't still understand, in my opinion, that it was still profiling me. They said, oh, no, you misunderstood us. We mean, how does it feel being a female in a man's job? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And my response was to take off my tools and stretch them out. Mm-hmm. And when they said, what are you doing? I said, if it's a man's job, you clearly can fix it. Go ahead and fix it and let me know when you're done.
Excuse me, let me close my windows here.
No problem.
Yeah.
And after I said that to them, they were like, well, we don't know how to fix it. I said, exactly. I said, the job is for the person that is skilled to do it. Right. It's for the person that is skilled to do the job. It's not gender oriented or anything. I said, so if you would like, I can go ahead and repair your service. But, it was like a double whammy, because for me, it wasn't, I first thought, is it because I'm Black? And then he said, oh, no, you're female. Well, that's not making it any better.
Right.
Rosie,
they couldn't do the job anyway, like they said.
Right.
When I say that it was both, so there's this concept we call intersectionality. It was first coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. Intersectionality, excellent example, and she was beginning to talk about the experiences of Black women, right? So in the workplace, so you have the racial piece, right?
Yes.
You're probably the only Black woman there. You're Black, but then you're a woman as well. And so there's this double whammy. That's intersectionality. Yes. How do we deal with the different elements of who we are? Because we're not, our identity is complex. We're not just one thing.
And even having that job, I had to deal with that on so many fronts, whereas it wasn't as much the ethnicity, but the gender thing, because I've had so many, especially white gentlemen, say, do you know what you're doing? And I had learned to say, do you know what I'm doing? And they were like, well, no. Okay, so if I told you I knew what I was doing and I didn't know what I was doing, would you think I knew what I was doing? I would play with words, because at the same time that they were doing it, I didn't want to make them feel uncomfortable that they were doing it. And I just I had to make it feel light, because I had a job to do that was beyond them trying to figure out what if they understood I knew what I was doing.
And so in microaggressions, there are these indignities that you experience. And here's the thing. As a Black woman, then you have to suck it up and go back to work.
Yes.
The question is, so Sharon, when we talk about what do people of color do with that you have these subtle things you deal with every day, right? And you have to go back. We talk about code switching. You have to go back to work, right? What do you do with that, right?
Right.
Where do you take that? And that stuff gets bottled up inside of us, and we carry it in our bodies.
And there's so minor.
Understand that. Yes, Miriam.
I apologize.
No, go
And
ahead.
I was just, along with what you were saying, there's so, at times can be so subtle, right? That what if you were to bring it up, that, oh, this is an issue of racism. The issue with microaggressions is that, you know, it's hard to have the evidence to even prove that, right? Because it's subtle. It's almost like, oh, that was not my intention, or you know, why is it now a big deal, right? Like, what is it that makes microaggressions so painful, Dr. Walters? What would you say?
Because these indignities and subtle things cut at our sense of personhood. And what we have essentially is our identity. How do we come to understand ourselves in a world that's very complex? And for people of color, when you're in the minority, and we see this, it happens in not only large institutions in corporate America, but in academia, right? And you look around and you see that you're a minority. Sometimes you're the only Black person in a class or whatever. So you're dealing with that. And these subtle indignities could really connect with and speak to your sense of personhood. And over time, there's this kind of cumulative effect that happens to you. So you have an event that is a kind of violation, right? It's an assault on your personhood. And then you have this traumatic reactions. So you might feel fear. You might be in this, I can't believe he said that to me. All right. You might be confused or feel you humiliated. And you take that with you and you don't do anything with it, because after a while, if you're a person of color, you get used to that, but it doesn't go anywhere because we keep trauma in our bodies, and our bodies don't lie, right? So we have this cumulative effect, and we may go home and not even talk about it because, hey, we're Black. That's what happens, right? And that cumulative effect is very, very powerful. And we begin to have these clusters of traumatic symptoms that accumulate. We may also deal with, invalidating an invalidating environment. That if we go to someone in HR or a colleague, sometimes even if we tell people about it, we may wonder about whether they're going to say we just pull in the race card or they're going to minimize it. And so we struggle with these barriers of invalidation or the structural racism. They're not going to really, there's nothing for us to address this.
Right.
We carry this in our bodies. We don't do, we haven't learned to do really emotional hygiene.
And you know, Dr.
Hygiene is where we take care of our feelings. And we've learned to stiff it up. We've learned to be tough and go there and get the job done, right? But we have these indignities and our feelings are hurt. And that becomes cumulative. Remember that you cannot conquer what you do not confront. So eventually, when you don't address that stuff, you might go postal.
Right.
I was getting ready to say, and people don't understand why people snap. You know, it's because the last straw has been placed on me, and I was at that breaking point. And you might have did something very minor, very, very little, very minute, but that was the last thing that I could take, you know?
A series of things that
all of the stuff that is piled up and piled up and piled up and piled up. And here I am so piled up. And then somebody just drops a feather. And that unfortunate feather dropper is the one that takes the brunt of my rage or frustration. And then the people are like, well, why'd she do that? You know, why that person do that? You know, it was uncalled for. You don't know how long that person has been dealing with the situations that they've been dealing with. And you're only seeing the end result of one thing, but you don't know the history of their problems, you know?
And given what, Black people and people of color have dealt with in the United States, it speaks to our resiliency. And I know we're going to get into that in the next, episode that Dr. Walters comes on with us on the 23rd. But, when you really think about it, you know, Black people are very resilient. And the fact that, and again, what I'm about to say, I do not want to happen at all. But the fact that Black people haven't taken up arms and just indiscriminately killed white people, you know what I mean, is speaks to a testament to us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And again, I'm glad we don't go there.
Right.
You know, but we are harboring, we are holding in a lot. As you know, Dr. Walters was saying, you know, this is not so much, you know, scientific, but 100%, you know, upwards of 90 for sure. You know, for those of us who have experienced, you know, racial trauma, and it's ongoing. It's not like it's stopped and now like it's a post trauma. It's an ongoing trauma, you know, with the microaggressions and with the, you know, obvious, you know, when we see the murders, the racial profiling and the murders that happen with police brutality. I mean, that's serious. I mean, this has been going on forever. We just have videos of it now.
Right.
Lynched by white folks and police since slavery, right? We know that's why policing started with slavery to catch the runaway slaves. So this is not new for us, right?
And it's
in generational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And can you
don't understand, I think, the seriousness of how it affects us mentally, emotionally, and behaviorally. That's why we wanted to have this conversation, so we can just have an understanding of the power of what it is that we've been through and how it may be manifesting in our everyday lives that we just think, oh, that's just us. No, that's our trauma speaking.
And Sharon and Dr. Walters, is it, it's my mindset going here, but also, isn't it because we have learned how to dance around this for so long that we don't address it because it's just the way it is with us. It's just the norm. So whereas let me say it like this, Dr. Walters, and you, any of you all can correct me, but if a white person deals with what the microaggressions that we deal with, they're very aggressive about it because you don't treat me like that. You don't, you know, but for us, we might look at them and say, why are you acting like that? Well, did you see what they just said to me? Yeah, they say that to me. They've been saying that to me for years. Why are you so mad? You know what I'm saying? So we have learned how to navigate this so well, but like you all are saying, we've never dealt with it on the aspect of microaggression and trauma and stuff, and we never seek help because, well, that's just the way things are. That it happened to my mom, it happened to my family, my uncle's in jail, he didn't do. I mean, you know, we look at all of these things and it's the norm. But now we're seeing things that are putting it up front and saying it may seem like the norm, but it should have never been the norm, and we need to address it right now.
Mm-hmm. And also, Rosie, like when a white person brings something up like that, it's never attached to their race, right? When a person, you know, commits a crime, it's never attached to like they did this because of their color. Whereas I wonder if sometimes Black people are already quick to be labeled, oh, an angry Black woman or an angry Black person, that sometimes people of color don't want to add to that stereotype. And that's why sometimes it's hard to name these things when they're happening, because well, if I bring something up, I'll just be stereotyped again instead of being addressed, and whatever I have to bring up will be tied back to me being a person of color, when that never happened for white people.
Right.
Yeah, so it goes back to Rosie, what we do is we normalize those experiences, right? And we often say, well, that's living in America for you. Or, you know, that's what it is like being a Black man in America or a Black woman, you know. And so there's a kind of subtle normalization of it. But what you were talking about, Marianne, is the fact that we struggle with what to do because we think the environment, and oftentimes our experiences suggest that the environment is invalidating. It invalidates our experiences. And we also understand structural racism. So a lot of us, we don't trust the court system because we think, oh, well, we're not going to get justice, right? So we have the structural racism or institutional racism. We have the environment that we think is very invalidating. And then we might also have in our own communities certain cultural prohibitions. For example, you know, even in the context of the church, we might have to deal with the message of, you know, well, we just take it to Jesus, or you know,
wow, yeah,
prayer, we need to press
So
into
true.
God.
yes,
You know, that's what our foreparents did. That the origins of the Black church and the Negro spiritual, the
yes,
way that our foreparents dealt with the injustices, is that they sang down by the riverside.
yes,
You know, those old Negro spirituals that still inspire us. They
yes,
sang their pain.
Yeah.
All right. They didn't march, they sang their pain. And so we can even have certain cultural prohibitions that gives us messages that we have to kind of accept it and so on, right? And those messages have been helpful. You know, turning to the church and you know, spiritual songs has been useful. But in many cases, though, there has been an injustice to how we have not taken care. I talk about emotional hygiene of ourselves. There's so many of our foreparents, the slaves and those in the Jim Crow period and beyond, even a lot of our grandparents have died with so much pain.
Yeah.
Part of the difficulty we have in our communities with going to therapy is that our foreparents, you know, you didn't go to therapy. You went to church. That's even a term. We don't go to therapy. That's what white folk do. You know, we go to church. And what essentially happens is that we carry all of this pain. We don't learn and haven't learned to do emotional hygiene. And oftentimes there's not the space for us to talk about that. We might do some stuff at the dinner table,
right,
but where do we process? Where do we do the emotional hygiene? And I'm so glad, Sharon, I'm glad for all of you inviting me and having this show, because we need to have places where we can talk safely about the pain that our people carry. And sometimes the way we do that is we go on someone's couch and we take care of our emotions.
yes,
That is good to tell it to Jesus, but sometimes you need to tell it to somebody that you can see.
And Jesus made counselors, right? You know, Jesus made counselors. That's what we're here for. One of his names is counselor, right?
yes,
In
yes.
the multitude of counselors,
Don't y'all start making me cry on here. Y'all better stop playing with this.
So, Dr. Walters, can you
This is
get into
good.
some specific symptoms so the audience can know what some of the symptomology looks like if they've experienced racial trauma? This might be some of the things you may be experiencing in your body, in your mind, in your emotions. What are some of the symptoms of racial trauma?
All right, so let's go back. So there's a racial event. Let's say you're pulled over, or maybe you ask for your credit card, okay, or you have an event, right? And you have a reaction to that event. You might feel violated, shock, you might have fear, you feel confused, you feel humiliated. I felt some kind of way when that woman asked me for my card, but I went along because I understood it. That's white privilege.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's like, okay, that's what we get for being Black, living in a Black body. And there's that cumulative effect. But then what eventually happens, and I talk about the invalidating of the environment, the structural racism, and all of this stuff, we become symptomatic. And now we're talking about, we're getting into an area where we are diagnosable in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And so an acronym that I use are what we call a mnemonic. And Marianne, you probably would remember this. I taught you this. RAW, the acronym RAW is RAAH. Those are the essential elements of trauma and PTSD. The R stands for re-experience. So we start to have this thing that happens to us. Anything in re-experiencing and trauma, anything that looks like, smells like, resembles the stuff that happened, we respond.
Triggers.
We respond, yes. It's a trigger for us, but we also respond in our bodies, right? And one of the A's then in Ra is arousal. We get aroused. And I can share, probably at some point, I might share an experience I had in my first year in this country where I experienced trauma being racially profiled by the police. So we have the arousal, our body responds because remember, the body keeps the score. And even when we forget, there's what we call emotional memories. Our bodies don't forget. And so we may forget that time we were pulled over, or that time that someone said something to us or blamed us for something, but our body don't forget. So we have an experience and we feel something in our bodies and we wonder, why am I nervous? Why do I feel this gnaw in my stomach? But that's the arousal that's happening. And the other is avoidance. So for some of us, we just stay away from white people, or we don't go into communities or whatever, right? That's kind of extreme, but we try to avoid anything that reminds us of the traumatic experience. And then the final aspect of that in the raw is the edge, which is the edge, we can come hyper aroused, not just aroused, but very aroused, but then what we call hyper vigilant, where we're always on the lookout. And we go into a room and we expect to be treated differently. And even our brothers and sisters in white bodies who are genuine and caring and are not racist, we don't trust them because we've learned to be on the lookout. We're hyper vigilant because over time, one of the messages we get is that I can't trust. All right. So we have these negative moods. So depression comes with trauma, anxiety. A lot of us are anxious. You know, Black people in this country are diagnosed with high blood pressure. High blood pressure is very common in our communities. And I tell people all the time, this is the way I say it. For the large amount of a high diagnosis of high blood pressure, it's not the pork. It's not the pork. It's the stuff we have to deal with. It's living in this society. It's the stuff we have to deal with.
When you're describing all of that, Dr. Walters, of being on the lookout, of not knowing when the next interaction like that may come from, and for a short time, these are meant to protect us, right? But at the same time, like what happens to our physical bodies, our nervous system, when we're not able to like let go and relax? Because you have to go to a job where you interact with white people all the time. You don't have a chance for your body to come from that arousal back down where you actually experience relaxation and healing and all of that. You're always at a heightened level.
You're always on alert. So one of the things that happen in trauma, when I talked earlier about trauma, is in the in the limbic system, all right, and the brain stem. The brain stem is that part of the brain that connects from the back base of the brain into the spinal cord, right? And so what happens when we experience a traumatic event, or what we call our sympathetic nervous system, is the part of our brain that prepares us for danger, is what we call the fight, flight, and freeze response. Animals have it too. If you come upon a cat suddenly or a dog, you'll notice they go on their hind legs and they go anytime, because animals share that same part of the brain. The thing about human beings, we're the highest evolved of mammals, so we have a more developed brain. And so when we perceive anything in the environment that is dangerous, we get into that fight, flight, that limbic system. And you know what the limbic system, what that's like? And we also get aroused when we get nervous and scared and anxious, the release of cortisol. Cortisol prepares our body to deal with a stressful situation.
Yes.
If you have too much cortisol, that's not good. Why you eventually have high blood pressure? It's like, if we remember after 9/11 in this country, we had these different codes. We had code red, this most dangerous, code orange and green. is like living in code red all the time.
Yeah.
Imagine you're walking around always in code red. No wonder a lot of us have high blood pressure, because the stress on the body takes its toll, because we never learn to get to what we call the parasympathetic nervous system,
Wow.
where we can relax. And when we're able to relax and become less anxious, now we can access the part of our brain that allows us to think clearly. You know, you can't perform well in school if you're on the way to the school, you're having a lot of experiences that are very anxiety provoking for you. So you get stuck there. Too much cortisol, too many of those neurotransmitters like adrenaline is being released. And that's not good on your body. It's too much of that on your body. And eventually you're going to have problems. I told you the body keeps the score.
It really does. And a lot of times we're just not in touch with it. And that's, you know, again, one of the reasons why we wanted to have the show in its entirety, but specifically racial trauma, because we're not, I don't believe that we are in touch enough with how racial trauma affects our mental, emotional, behavioral, and physical and spiritual well-being. And so we need to be informed. We just need to be educated about it. Because as you said, Dr. Walters, we think it's, and not that the foods that we eat don't play a part, but that's not the only part, right? And how much are we considering racial trauma being a part of why we have hypertension? Now that you've shared that, it's like, wow, that makes total sense. Now I begin to think about my experiences differently. And when I come home from a work and having a headache because of a racial encounter, I haven't eaten anything, haven't eaten any pork or whatever, right? But this is a tension headache because I'm stressed because of this racial encounter. Now with this education, I can put two and two together. And now I know that I've had many experiences like this. Now that I'm educated to it, I probably need to sit down and speak with someone about it, even if it's a support group and not just, you know, just say deep individual counseling, but a support group of people who understand what I've been through, because they've been through it as well. And I feel comfortable speaking with them about it because I can relate to them and they can relate to me.
And one of the things that you can do, Sharon, is very simple. It's a very simple thing. So I teach my students this. Trauma cannot exist in a relaxed body. So one of the, and this is kind of getting into what we'll talk about on the 23rd, one of the very simple way to begin to heal trauma is to relax our bodies. All right. And so we teach people how to relax. So you can begin to learn, Sharon, how to relax. You come home, you got to pay attention to your body and work at relaxing your body, because we live too much. You know, one of the things I learned, if you notice yourself, if you get in touch with your body and you notice yourself, right, your pelvic muscle, like you're tight. Some of us are tight. We're walking around and our butts are squeezed. That's because our pelvic muscles are too tight. We're walking around with a lot of anxiety and we're not relaxed. And it's a good way to check in on your body. I'm running ahead of myself here for the 23rd.
That's okay.
And notice where we feel tight. Where is the stress in our body? And we carry it. We don't learn how to relax. So a very simple way to begin to address the trauma is to learn how to relax, how to begin to care for your body, because of the experience that you may have had that was so anxiety provoking and stressful that you went into limbic system mode, all right, and you stayed there.
Right.
I said trauma can't tell time, because you get home hours later, you're still behaving like you did in the morning when you were in the highway. As good as still happening.
Yes. Right. Yeah. We have some questions from our listeners
here for you. It says, what are some of the ways that racial trauma is misdiagnosed in ways that negatively label people of color? That's a very good question, because the mislabeling happens all the time. But I'm going to let Dr. Walters answer that.
Well, I think that because there are two things essentially here in terms of the diagnosis, right? And so the diagnosis of racial trauma does not exist in the DSM. This last edition of the DSM, and I'm still studying it, because in March of this year, the American Psychiatric Association brought out a new edition. It is the DSM-5 TR. TR means treatment revised. And what they do is they update some stuff. And this latest version, they've actually paid a little more attention to the racial and ethnic pieces, which I'm happy about. But so clinicians do not really have a sense, especially clinicians not of color, in terms of the kind of questions to ask. And when we look at the old diagnosis of PTSD, in criteria A, where there's supposed to be an event and so on, that a lot of times that is lost in terms of fitting into that criteria, something that is a racial experience, right? So bona fide experiences that we have that are traumatic, a clinician might miss that, all right? And not really see it as a traumatic event. And I think that's very important. So we have people are unaware of the impact of discrimination unless you have been on that side. There are things that happen and you may not be aware of how it affects people. And so there are a lot of experiences that we feel to label as traumatic. I was talking earlier about we normalize things. And clinicians can often fear to ask questions. Now, yes. I can tell you a lot of times in clinical setting, the question is not asked, well, have you ever had any experiences of discrimination? Or those questions are not asked. So we're learning a little more understanding that oftentimes, and we know this, the data is very clear that people of color overwhelmingly experience more PTSD, more trauma than people in white bodies, right? But the actual diagnosis of PTSD in terms of racial trauma is missed because the symptoms we talk about that I just described, there are symptoms that meet the diagnosis for PTSD. But if we don't ask the right questions, or if we don't have a framework to understand that what happened to that woman or that man, right, is a traumatic experience, then we're not going to ask those questions. It's just something that happened, right? And that's why I began by defining what trauma is in itself.
Those types of questions should be added to every intake.
Yes, exactly.
Along with, have you experienced domestic violence? Have you experienced, other types of violence? Have you experienced racial trauma? And
so we ask those questions. We might ask about violence. We talk about family stuff, but we don't ask about experiences of racism or stuff like that. Have you ever been bullied in school? Have you ever been profiled by the police? Have you ever been harassed racially at work? Have you ever experienced microaggressions? Those kinds of questions are not asked. So we miss a lot of data. And for people of color who are sitting on the couch, we may not bring it up because there's no question that leads us there. And we've come from a context where we're so used to having these experiences that they're very normal for us.
Right.
And I think
I'm sorry, Rosie. Patrick says most of us would not go into deep analysis of our emotions to recognize trauma. Can you speak to the fact that, in my estimation as a clinician, we don't have to go into deep analysis. It's just that we just have to get in touch with our emotions, just generally, because we're not even socialized, many of us, especially people of color, to even acknowledge the surface emotions. We're taught to deny them. Because it's a sign of weakness, as opposed to strength. We have to go on. So we have to suppress. We have to deny. Right. So it's not even deep analysis, just like learn how to know yourself emotionally. And
right. That's why I talk about what I meant by emotional hygiene. We don't do emotional hygiene. We don't, stuff happened to us and we come home. We don't take care of the disappointments, the hurts, all the little things we have in a given day, right? It's just normal, right? Don't do anything with that. And that stuff affects us. We have to take care of our soul. We have to take care of our mental health because it is part of who we are. When our feelings get hurt, we have to be able to talk about it. You know, today I was driving to work and this happened, and you know, talk to your family, talk to somebody about it. You don't necessarily may not need to go to a therapist, but you have to find a place where you can do that.
Absolutely.
Care for your emotions. So we emotionally constipated, and we engage in emotional incarceration because we have a lot of bad teaching or lack of teaching about emotions. And for men, it is worse.
Yes.
Because remember, big boys don't cry. And remember, so we do it both ways. Big boys don't cry. And mamas even do this. Why are you crying, Johnny? Come on, suck it up. Come on, you're a boy. You suck it up, right? So we get messages that we shouldn't feel. And what we do with women is we say, oh, Rosie, she is so emotional. And when the guys get together, you say, you wouldn't believe what happened. You know, last night I came home and, you know, my wife, she is so emotional. And then someone else jump on and we bashing the women. They're too emotional. We label them. So what happens over time is we associate emotions with women,
right,
and not with men.
And weakness with men if they cry, and
yes, they cry.
You got to man up, and all
yeah,
that.
you got to man up, right?
Right.
Don't be a wuss. Come on, you're soft. I had a client once who I went to see him. He was in a facility. He was a adolescent. He was in a facility, juvenile facility. So I went to see him because he had gotten into a fight and got arrested and all that. And I go to see him, and I said to him, "So what happened?" And he tells me this story of someone. This is a young black male doing something, and here's what he said to me. You know, I don't want him to think that I'm soft. I don't want him to think that I'm weak. You know, so that's and we talk about hyper masculinity, right?
Right.
I don't want this other guy to think that I am soft and weak. So I had to fight, right?
Yeah.
So not get arrested, and you know what happens after that, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So we have to address issues of the gender bias, the sexist stuff, and how we teach about emotions that doesn't allow us to properly care for ourselves because we see emotions as soft. There is a line, a continuum, that anything that is soft is feminine, and anything that's hard or strong is masculine.
Right.
And the reality, you know what the reality is?
He harms both people. He harms men and women.
Of course. Emotions are not masculine or feminine.
Right, right.
They're human.
And I
Real
believe
men
that
have
it's a sign
feelings.
of strength to be able to acknowledge how you feel. And it's not about who's in the room. I'm acknowledging how I feel, and I am comfortable with myself enough to emote in this moment. And in that is strength.
Absolutely.
And so we've been miseducated, missocialized to think that emotions and crying and all of that, this is one of my pet peeves. I talk about it all the time, that it is a sign of weakness when in actuality is a sign of strength. It is the total opposite.
All right. Well, here's the other piece. Here's the other piece, right? That in our larger culture, we teach, and even in the church, we teach from a strength-based perspective. That you got to be strong. And we find two scriptures that reinforce the idea of strength. And we don't teach or preach about weakness. And I think that a healthier model of manhood is because the reality in terms of human nature, we are both strong and weak.
Yes.
Right? We are both hard and soft. We're both. All right. But we operate so much, even from the scriptures we're drawn to strength. We preach a lot and teach a lot of blessing and all of that. And we don't teach and talk about suffering and weakness, right? And so we don't embrace those parts of us that nurtures our soul, because we think we always have to be strong.
Right.
Dr. Walters, you know
I
what
have
one of my
people in my
favorite
office
scriptures
who
is?
apologize about crying, and I usually challenge me. I said, Rosie, don't you ever apologize for crying in this.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think when we cry, we are our most authentic self.
Yes.
Mhm.
I had women who cry and they apologize. Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, why are you sorry? I'm not sorry. I'm happy. I'm glad to see you crying.
Right.
It needs to come out.
Yes.
Oh yeah, because if I don't cry, sometimes I might get a little wild. I might get angry.
Yeah.
I'm Dr. Walters. I'm just being real. But
Yeah,
if that tear didn't come down here, the hand might have come up here.
No, absolutely. You better cry, because if I don't cry, I might go postal.
Yes.
Right. It's all bottled up inside when you don't cry.
Mhm. Yeah.
You know? But Dr. Walters, when you were speaking about strength and weakness, one of my favorite scriptures is his strength is perfected in my weakness. Right? Where we are weak, strong. And if we never get to a place where we can acknowledge our weakness, how can God take up his strength in us? Right? He can't perform it because we're always thinking that we know we got it. And we don't, because he really is our strength. And we have to come up under that. We have to submit to that. And when we submit to that, anything is possible. But absolutely. I'm not going to start preaching. That's your job, Dr. Walters.
Look, I was about to pick up the collection plate. I was like, okay, these two are getting started here.
Oh my goodness. So Patrick had another question, Dr. Walters. He said, how come, and I guess he's talking about people of color, how come we don't shoot up schools? If there's an answer that you have for that one.
Well, I think, and going back to some of what we were talking about earlier, I certainly affirm what you shared, Sharon. Black people are some of the most resilient people in the world.
Amen.
Right? And so we have a long history of resilience, going back to slavery and the way we were, even going back to the Middle Passage and survival, on those ships where we didn't have enough room as a man having his coffin. And so we have a history of resilience. Black people as well, and this is what I call African retention. That is an element of our culture that we brought from Africa, that's part of us, that we've been able to survive because we have a deep sense of spirituality, right?
Yes.
A deep understanding of spirituality helps to keep us grounded. And we have just learned how to cope with stuff. And so we don't go and shoot at schools. And verily, whenever you hear a school shooting, generally is not a Black person, I think we've just learned some ways to deal with stuff over time. And it doesn't mean that we're necessarily healthier than other people. We have some strength as resilient people, but in some areas we haven't found ways, as we've been talking about all evening, outlets to take care of ourselves, and we keep a lot of stuff in. All right.
Spirituality, community.
We understand too the structure of racism. Our understanding of structural racism, and there aren't many Black people that trust the criminal justice system. So I think we're smart in terms of how we think about what would happen if we do that. And so a combination of all of those things, I think, might explain why we don't shoot up schools.
Right.
We have another question from Patrick regarding vicarious trauma. You don't have to experience it directly, just watching TV or surfing the web, watching injustice every day. Can you speak to vicarious trauma?
Vicarious trauma. What Patrick said is correct. He nailed it. It seems like more a comment than a question, right? That's exactly right what he said. Vicarious trauma, we also call it secondary traumatization, which means that we can become traumatized. And if we look at the diagnosis for PTSD, it clearly says in criteria A that it doesn't have to happen to us, but just witnessing it or hearing about it, we can be traumatized, right? And so it happens a lot. Let me give you some example. First responders. You may not remember this, but during Hurricane Katrina, there were 3 police officers that committed suicide, right? Let us come a little closer if you don't remember that far, right? January 6th, how many police officers committed suicide, right? The stress is the trauma, right? So vicarious traumatization. And for those of us who are clinicians, when we are working with trauma, in one of my trauma classes, at the end, one of the last topics I teach is self-care, because we need to take care of ourselves, because when we're hearing all of this stuff, remember, we carry it in our bodies. And those of us who are very good at empathy, and there are some individuals we call empaths. I consider myself an empath. And the thing about empaths, they have deep empathy, but you also, there are times you actually experience what people are feeling. So there are times I actually feel people's pain. I feel it. And so you have to find outlets for that. And so there are a number of instances. We see it with police officers. This is data that doesn't come to the news, but I get a lot of it anecdotally. Check out the amount of fire officers, firemen that commit suicide. Suicide rates among firemen is high. All right. And police officers, I mean, I should have a long line outside my office for police officers needing therapy. So we can be traumatized in a secondary way as a result of hearing, witnessing. We see it happens, for Black people, every time we have a shooting, and it's like, okay, George Floyd, well, maybe the nation gets it. And then we hear a story of a young Black man who is handcuffed and is face down, but then you shoot him in the head. And so what it does then, it takes us back. We actually, as people, we feel the pain when we see these shootings. We can get traumatized, right? That's doing something to us over time. That is what vicarious traumatization is. So the reality is, hearing all of the violence, all this stuff, we got to take care of our mental health, because that stuff is in our bodies, and we process it. We feel the pain. Oftentimes we cry.
And not only feel the pain, Dr. Walters, but the anger that comes behind that pain. You feel it, you see it happen again, you end up crying, but then you feel enraged because you just get so angry that it's just.
Yeah. And in addition to the personal experiences and seeing these vicarious stories on TV or the news, there's the family members that experience that, right? So I imagine having stories of, for those who are parents, hearing your child at school having these experiences, where a sibling, people you care about in the community, has to be, really a lot too.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. Whenever we hear a young Black male shot, that's our son, and we live communal. The thing about people of color, essentially, we're very communal, right?
Yes.
So George Floyd, it's not some stranger,
Right.
in Minnesota. Like, that's our brother, right?
Right.
I had an experience, if she's watching this podcast or later, she may be a little embarrassed about this, but she's gonna have to die so that others might live tonight. But when we got the story of Ahmaud Arbery's death, and that came out later, because by the time it was released, it had happened like more than a month or so.
Right.
Yeah.
But somebody leaked. Thank God for cameras, right?
Yes.
And so we had a conversation at our dinner table. My daughter, my wife, and I think one of my sons were there. And I mean, we were sad. We were really sad. And like you were saying, Rosie, the anger, I experienced a lot of I tell people there are 2 emotions that I experience quite a lot living in this country. And there's no shame in me saying that. anger and sadness.
Yes.
Often. And so we were talking, and then the next day my daughter came downstairs and she was crying. And we were wondering, like, what is wrong? I'm not going to call her name. And my wife said, what's wrong? So I went to her and hugged her. And she called Ahmad's name and she talked about her brothers. Now, at the time when that happened, one of my sons live on the main line and he's a jogger.
Mm-hmm.
So when she saw Ahmad, she was thinking of her brother who she loves.
Right.
Are you with me? He lives on the main line, predominantly white community, and he's a jogger. And so the next day, she is in distress.
Yes.
That's a vicarious trauma. She's in distress because one of her Black brothers in Georgia was shot and killed, and she saw it like hit her own brother.
Right.
That's the kind of impact it makes on us.
Yes, it does.
That's vicarious traumatization.
Right. And it is so true. I mean, I'm sure, we all have examples of people who we know, who are African American, and other people of color, but it's just we are a family, right? And we can see ourselves in other people who are brutalized and murdered. And it just rings so true. And it would just think, I have a brother, I have a father, like that could easily be them, right? And or me, because it's not like it doesn't happen to Black females, more often to Black males. And this is a constant thought every time we see it on the news. And even when we don't see it on the news, we know that it happens.
Yes.
So it's always in the back of our minds whenever we get stopped by the police or whenever we just see a police officer. You don't even have to be, stopping us. It's just like, okay, we have to make sure that I'm doing everything right. You're already doing everything right, but you have to even if you're doing everything right, it creates like a paranoia.
Yes.
That's exactly what it creates.
Yeah.
The panic, especially if you hear the lights going off, you just automatically like
the anxiety starts to rise.
You start pulling to the side, they ain't even behind you. You're pulling to the right, ready.
Over first.
like really? But this is such a norm that you just go into panic mode and
that's that limbic system that starts in. Your body gets
it's like ready. It makes me think of memory foam. When you meant that, it's like memory foam. You press down and it remembers the mark you put. And it's like that. It's like our internal organs are memory foams. And when somebody presses on it, that indentation comes back. And you feel those same imprints that happened when it happened before.
Excellent,
and those
Rosie.
Emotions start bubbling up in response to that impression that is on your heart, on your emotions, on your mind,
Rosie, that's an excellent explanation. You did a great job explaining that.
You can use it.
Yeah.
We love Rosie. And Dr. Walters, I was curious now that we're talking about this, your experience.
No, y'all realize we are over an hour. You good?
Yeah, we're good as long as you're good.
I'm good. I'm having fun.
It went by so quickly.
Good stuff.
Go ahead, Mariana.
Yeah, I was curious about your experiences in your home island of Barbados versus here with experiences like that.
Oh my goodness. So I was thinking whether I should share this because I didn't want to spend a lot of time talking about me or my story, but to respond to this question, your question, which is a good one, I want to share my experience in my first year in this country. So growing up on the island, I would say there are a couple of differences in, the islands of the Caribbean and the US, right? So I usually tell people, look, we're, for myself as someone from the island and Sharon and Rosie, we all came on the same slave ship, right? So in some instances, the ship, when it came across the Atlantic, it went south and dropped us off on these little rocks we call islands. And then, came up north and dropped you off here on this large landmass we call North America, or it may have come to you first. But I think oftentimes the ships went that way and then came up. So we were on the same slave ship. We are brothers and sisters, right? But our experiences are different in terms of geography. But there are a couple of significant things historically, right? So if I think about my island of Barbados, in the English-speaking Caribbean as a whole, emancipation of slavery came in 1834, right? And your emancipation, all right, came much later. But one of the critical things to remember as well is that in the 1960s, because I'm a 60s kid, and Dr. King was my hero as a little boy, and I would recite the "I Have a Dream" speech and all that. I was very aware of what was happening here in the U.S. But while African Americans were fighting, just coming through Jim Crow and just trying to get the vote and all that, we have the civil rights movement in the 60s. Well, in the English-speaking Caribbean, those islands were independent and were led by people who look like us. So if you think about 1968, right? We think about the movement, and we think about the death of Dr. King. Well, we had in Barbados, for example, independence from Britain in 1966.
Wow, see?
And so we're voting, we're self-governing, but our leaders, our prime ministers, look like us, and we're predominantly Black. So when someone from the Caribbean comes to the U.S., they have a different kind of perspective. And honestly, people from the Caribbean do not carry the same baggage as African Americans carry.
Yes. Because
we don't have those experiences. I was never pulled over by a cop. I mean, we're 90-something% Black, right? And so we don't have the same. Now, of course, we had racism, we had slavery, we're descendants of slaves, but the experiences that you had, of Jim Crow and all of that, we did not experience those. So here's what happened my first year here. I was racially profiled, and I'm not going to go into the details, but it was a situation where I went to a bank and I was profiled, and then the police came to my apartment after I did my transaction. Terrified me. And then I was pulled over several times after that. And at the time, what helped me, I was seeing a therapist then. I was doing psychoanalysis. I was seeing this analyst because I wanted to do psychoanalysis like the traditional way that Freud did. So I was a patient going 5 times a week. And thank God for that season in my life. I talked a lot about what was happening to me. And I had those experiences of feeling like when I saw a police car, I literally had knots in my stomach.
Yes.
And I would notice my body, my heart would be racing, and I would have those experiences. But the first experience I had of profiling with the police, it made me feel so close to African Americans in a way I had not before. I was pretty radical on the island. I was one of those at the university, free Mandela and all of that stuff. And I knew what was going on here and felt connected to Black people here, but nothing brought me closer like the experience I had. So here's the thing. I'm bringing it home, Mariana. And I think this is a phenomenon, and it explains partly what happens with white privilege. When you're the majority culture, you don't think or forced to think about yourself and your identity in the same way. So living in Barbados and growing up in Barbados, outside of the fact that, because my undergrad degree was in history and sociology, so I know the history, and I was a history teacher in high school. Outside of that, I did not walk around with, oh, I am Black. I didn't carry my shoulder because we're all Black and my leaders are Black, right? When a Black man comes or Black woman comes to America, you are baptized. And if you didn't know you were Black, well, you certainly realize
you're gonna find out.
And so my experience here was it was like a punch in the face. I started to realize, and when I drove certain places, I would be anxious. And so I think that there's some essential differences and there's a uniqueness about racism in America that's very different.
Yes, it is.
Yes. It's an aggressive, but also subtle. There's a unique racism in this country that even people who come from other countries that there's racism, there's something unique about this. And so coming from a place where you're predominantly Black and I didn't carry it on my sleeve, so to speak, once I got here, that changed.
And it's a shell shock, isn't it? It's a shell shock.
It's a shock.
You know, it's like it's a shock to the system that because you don't understand, it's like, what the heck is going on? And for us, we've learned to walk the line because this has been our experience. But when somebody comes here, it's like, what? Y'all let them treat you like this? You want to go to jail? Or you want to act a fool? You'll be in jail. We'll be bonding you out next week.
Dr. Walters, what do you think is the difference, like in, say, Europe versus America? You know, there's racism everywhere, but why is it so different here?
That's a great question. And so I'm going to attempt my sort of first quick cut at that. I think it has to do with, it's really about the American experiment because in a sense, America is an experiment.
Right.
It goes back to the way this country was built.
Yes.
It was built on white supremacy.
Yes.
All right. If we look at what happened with the first settlers and what happened to Native Americans, right? It's an aggressive, unique kind of racism and white supremacy that led to the eradication of those people and all of what happened, right? And then subsequently the bringing of slaves, all right? You know, the history of Europe, particularly, you know, when we think about the Europeanization of the world, so we think about Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Holland, right? Those are the predominant European countries that moved out in the world. The Caribbean is an excellent example. So we have British islands, we have the French Caribbean islands, we have Spanish Caribbean islands, we have the Dutch Caribbean, Curacao, Saba, all right? Very interesting. Europe came to the New World, to this region they call the New World, right? And so there is some distinctiveness in when we think about Europe and Europe's attempt to conquer the world, because that was driven by a desire for wealth and conquest, and we can go into all of that history. So then we have Europeans come into the US, finding native people, and essentially engaging in genocide and conquest, right?
Yeah.
And then we have slavery to reinforce that in terms of working on the cotton plantations, the cotton fields. So for the US, it was cotton. For my part of the world, it was sugarcane, molasses and rum, all right, to fatten the coffers of Europe. All right. And so there's a kind of aggressive and distinct racism here built on white supremacy and what needed to happen in order to dominate. And I think that the distinctive nature of that is different in some ways to some of what we see in Europe, even though there is some connection because it was Europeans that came and settled. I don't know if that answers your question, but
It does. It makes total sense. And
right.
I'm going to ask this question, and this is not off topic, but I just kind of want to get your thoughts, and ladies, your thoughts too. Because, you know, America is an experiment, just as you said, right? And some say, and I'm not saying I agree with this or not, but, you know, it's hard not to agree with it. Maybe it's just too much for the human capacity. Maybe we better off Italians living with Italians in Italy, and Irish living with Irish in Ireland. Are we better off segregated? So, and without and maybe can we overcome this race issue? Can we? It doesn't seem like we can overcome this race issue, and so we've tried. We gave it a good try, right?
Well, Sharon, I see it as an ethnic issue because, you know, as a child of God,
can we overcome it?
But that's what I'm saying. If we get past the race thing and come to the full and complete godly understanding that there is only one race, and that is the race of mankind, human race.
Okay,
you know,
but even if we do that, Rosie, even if we do that, your color and my color is different than the white color. People will still see color, right? And if we want to make a distinction where there really isn't, right? Because we're all humanity, right?
Yeah, race is a social construction.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and man-made social construction.
Yes.
So, yeah. So we take that away. We're still going to see color, and it's about the economics, right, Dr. Walters, as you talked about, to have someone's inferior, someone's superior, so we can reign, so to speak. Right. But if we can we do it? We have not done it thus. We've made strides, but you know, I don't know.
It's a very difficult question because people have to get past that hate, that bias that they feel towards someone that doesn't look like them. And if you don't hate me because I'm black, if you get rid of all the black people in the United States, then you're going to hate the next person because they have slanted eyes. Exactly. Well, then when you get rid of them, then you're going to hate these people because they're this or that.
Brown hair versus, I agree.
It is difficult to answer.
I think there's a lot of beauty in diversity. I have grown so much more as a person coming from a country where there was still some ethnicities, just because of like Moldova's politics. There's like some Russians and Ukrainians and then Romanians, and I was a Romanian speaker, but not to the level that's here. And I think there's so much beauty in diversity. And one of my favorite things actually to see is going to Brooklyn Tabernacle in New York and seeing a choir full of diverse people, and I picture heaven like that too.
It is like that.
and I think that's why, if we address these issues, hopefully over time and as more generations pass, I can only hope you'll get better. But I think there's actually a lot more beauty and growth that can come from diverse.
I love diversity too, and where there's differences, we produce, right?
Yes.
And when we come together, and I believe in Dr. Walters, you can speak to this, the way to solve it is to come together and get to know one another, to be relational, because it's hard to dislike someone we understand and know, right?
Yeah. From my perspective, the cure, or what is going to address all the isms, not just racism, but sexism and all the isms, is relationship.
Yes,
relationship. When we build relation, and we've seen that, right? That when people build relationships with people who are different from themselves and get to know them, it breaks down all of their prejudices and
assumptions. That's good.
And actually, your question is a great one, Sharon. And maybe none of us here may live to see it fully, and we're always going to be a work in progress, because the essential issue is a heart issue, really.
Yes,
this is why I believe that that the gospel offers the best hope, right?
Yes.
But we see pockets of how this can happen in many parts of our country, right? communities that are diverse and people living together and respect. You know, Mariana just shared about Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir. We see pockets of this, and we know it is possible. So what we have to do is not get hopeless and not become apathetic. We have to watch apathy, and we have to keep doing working at changing our communities one person at a time, one podcast at a time.
Yes, Dr. Walter.
One podcast
one broadcast at a time.
Yes.
And we're working. You know, I talk about dying that you may live. And this is this may sound strange, but as a principle, because I believe it's a life principle, in order for people to live, somebody has to die. And sometimes in families, people don't live or grow until someone dies. That's a little deep here, right? That the cycle of life is about dying and living, dying and living, dying and living. And those of us who are on this planet now, at some point, we got to die to make room for the next generation.
Yes.
Right.
And so here's the thing. And Jesus had to die so that we can live. Understand that as a spiritual principle. So watch this. George Floyd, life, and I would describe him as a martyr.
Yes.
Right? That and I don't claim to know God's will in that, but God certainly allowed it if he didn't cause it, right? So we talk about God's permissive will and all that, right? But the life of George Floyd as a martyr has led to so much change already in this country.
Yes.
And people are more open to have conversations. I'm not saying it's all hunky-dory all around, right? Because we've seen the backlash with all the attacks on the 1619 Project and critical race theory and the fight to teach our history in schools. We've seen that, right? But the point is that there's an awareness of the prejudice of racism in a way that it never was before. So the death of George Floyd has created a movement globally, actually, for good, that his life, his death was not in vain.
Right.
Follow what I'm saying. And so what we have to do is not move to apathy, and particularly as believers, we have to live hopeful, because the last image, there are two things. The first image of the church in the book of Acts is an image of diversity. These people from all different parts of Asia Minor were gathered together in a room to pray. And they heard praying tongues in their other language. The first image is an image of diversity.
Yes.
And then the last image we have in Revelation, when John is on the Isle of Patmos, in the image he had of heaven, I saw a great number of people who couldn't be numbered, of all nations and kingdoms and languages, sitting before the throne. So we have to continue to fight for diversity, because the image we have in scripture is an image of heaven with all kinds of people.
Exactly. We know that Jesus himself was not white, right?
Right. And watch this. I'm going to go to John 17. What did Jesus do? He prayed for us in his dying, the last prayer that Jesus did. So we would say is on his deathbed, so to speak, metaphorical. Jesus knew that they were about to come and arrest him and take him to be crucified. And his final prayer, recorded in John 17. And Father, I pray that there be one, as you and I are one. And I pray for them. He prayed for his disciples, and then he prayed for us. He says, not only for them, the disciples, but I pray for all those who will come in his name. And Jesus, several times in that prayer, prayed for us. He says that you be one, I pray, Holy Father, that they be one, that they get it. Just as the way that you and I flow, that they would flow and connect like that. So we can't give up. That's the message. But the message has to be a message of hope, and we have to change heart. It's really hard work.
It is.
Hard work.
Their heart don't change. They're not going to love. They're not going to open their hearts to people who are different.
Right.
And I believe that the church has the most powerful message about that, the gospel.
Absolutely.
But, you know, we mess it up too.
We do. In our humanity, we do.
But we have the message, the gospel.
Yeah.
All players at the table. And so yeah, I don't know if we'll get there. I think we're getting closer. And you know, we keep working in every generation. And actually there's even greater hope, because this generation, so if you think about Gen Z and Gen X, they are grown up in more diverse communities.
Yes.
Here's some statistics. And I have a video of this in Mississippi. The Mississippi of all places, the interracial marriages, the rate has gone through the roof. Yes. And if we go back to the 2000 census, between 2000 and the 2010 census, the biracial population, so kids who are born from two different races or ethnicity, biracial population increased by 50%. I haven't really looked and studied the 2020 census, but I'm very curious to see what the biracial population look like.
Right.
And so we're seeing that. We're seeing younger people now, Gen Z and Gen X, who are more open to interracial dating and so on. And so those walls are starting, you know, and I think we have to continue the work. Because God's vision for us is that we learn to live together and respect each other.
And the younger generation is not afraid to speak up about it.
Like even to their parents, even to their own parents.
Well, watch this. You know, so I go back to George Floyd. You know what was so encouraging in all of the marches and the protests after? Did you see how many white bodies were in those marches? A lot of young people.
Yeah.
And I've even talked to women who said, oh, my daughter made me, you know, my daughter made me come. So the young people were encouraging their white parents to come. I mean, there were a lot of white people marching.
Yes, yes.
That tells you something. That was a very diverse. You know, it's easy to sort of put it on Black people because George Floyd was Black. But those marches were very diverse.
All over the world.
Beautiful.
All over the world,
That's a good sign.
It is a good sign.
That's a good sign.
It was
so
beautiful
we have
to see.
the work, Sharon. You asked a great question, but I think we're doing a little better than we did, and there's reason for hope. But if we don't hope, what we're going to do? You can't roll over and die.
Exactly.
You know, in the words of Jesse Jackson used to say, keep hope alive.
Right?
Keep hope
Absolutely.
alive.
Well, Dr. Walters, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on our show tonight. You have blessed us with your presence and so much wisdom and knowledge that I can't even say enough. And we just thank you so much for taking time out of your day to spend with us on this topic that's so important and so necessary to get out to the masses. So we appreciate you so very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. It's been good to hear. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. And we will see you back for part 2, which will be racial healing on June 23rd at 7 p.m. on Race Matters. So, ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to join us again. You want to see Dr. Walters again. And I know you do. Dr. Walters, there were several comments on the feed. Thanking you for your presentation and that they got a lot out of what you were saying. So you were well received, and we just thank you so much.
Yes,
because, you know, you have a wealth of knowledge about this topic, and we need the community needs to hear this information. So much information is locked up in our institutions of higher learning, right? But everybody's not going to go there, right? And so we need to. That's why this platform is so important. We need to get the message out to the masses with information that is factual. you know, to have a better understanding of who we are and how we operate and how we can move from one place to the other to be better. Because that's what it's about. One person helping the next person be better. And we are here on this platform to help all of us. We don't have all the answers. We have some. We don't have all the answers, but we go to Jesus, right?
Yes, we do.
Take on the mind of Christ, right? To be able to come here and give that out on this platform in love, because Jesus is about love. And that's why our tagline, I don't know if you know that, Dr. Walters, it's Race Matters, a safe place to have the hard conversation.
I saw that. I like it. Yes.
So thank you again. And we can't wait to have you back on the 23rd.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the Facebook page, click the notification bell so you'll know when we're on again. And we don't just have Race Matters on, we do other shows as well. And continue to comment, and we'll get answers to you if we can with the comments or questions that you may have. Still do that if you're watching on the replay. Please, if you're watching on the replay, please put your comments and questions there. We always go back and try to answer if we can, and we enjoy going back for those. We know everybody can't watch live because it's not in their schedule, so we enjoy engaging with those of you who are watching on the replay, and we appreciate everyone equally. So thank you so much. We love you. God bless you. Have a God evening. Shalom.
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 Good evening.